To review how we started last month, the U.S. Capitol Historical Society gathered the funds to paint some corridors in the Capitol on the House side. The Senate had beautifully painted corridors by Brumidi, but the House did not. And so the okay, everybody can see that now. I don't know why my computer obeys Sam when it doesn't obey me, but at any rate. Here in the Capitol, there were corridors in the basement on the Senate side that had been painted, but not on the House side. Here's the arrow showing where the Brumidi corridors were. But the U.S. Capitol Historical Society decided that for our bicentennial gift to the Capitol, we should paint inspiring corridors on the House side. And so the orange corridors here are the Brumidi corridors on the Senate side. The blue ones are the Cox corridors on the House side. And last week we looked at, or last month, I mean, we looked at the corridors on the lower part of the screen here on the left. And today we're going to look at the long corridor that's broken into two pieces that goes from the bottom to the top. Here's a photograph of it on the right here. You can see part of the problem was that the hallways in this part of the building very narrow compared with the ones on the Senate side. And so the decision was made to put the paintings on the ceilings. And so this is what we got. This is a comparison. The Brumidi corridors on the left, you can see a nice wide corridor there. And but Cox faced a different problem in making scenes for the other side. Here's Allyn Cox at work on the Cox corridors. He died in 1982 in the midst of the process, but he did most of the corridor that we're going to be talking about today. There are three corridors that you can see listed on the left here. This is an old brochure from the Capitol that was a walking tour back when they would allow people to walk through the building. And it was just this week that I noticed that at the bottom, the Hall of Capitals that we talked about last month is actually misspelled on the brochure with an A instead of an O. But the corridor we're going to talk about today is the one that's marked in blue here on this floor plan. Now, to sort of decode the thing, I have put some arrows in here to show you what I'm going to be talking about. There are historical scenes which are marked with the green arrow and the pink arrow. And then there are vignettes, which are the ones marked with the blue arrow. And then there are quotations, which are marked with the orange arrow. So I'm going to go through these three sets separately. And I'm going to stop after each one and invite questions. So think about what we're doing here, because what we're trying to do is to talk about American society and what we have built, ending, of course, early in the 20th century. But the scenes that are in here are ones that are familiar to us. One of the interesting things about comparing the Brumidi and the Cox corridors is that the Brumidi corridor, being done by an Italian of Greek extraction, is much more allegorical and involves a lot of mythology and European symbolism. The Cox corridors don't involve nearly so much of that and are much more accessible to Americans with what we know. So that's what we're going to talk about here today. This hall is called the Great Experiment Hall, and as you saw, it's broken into two equal sections. There are 4 bays per section and 2 murals per bay. Each of those little squares are a bay in the construction of the building. There are 2 murals per bay and 2 vignettes per mural. and then 2 busts. And I've marked the busts here. They were not on the drawing from the pamphlet that I got this, but they are there, and they're in between the vignettes. They would be right at the top of the vault of the arch. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to go through these separately and see each of these artworks in this section of the building. The Great Experiment Hall has 16 murals. These are the biggest of the paintings. And you can see they're in chronological order, the Mayflower Compact and so forth. And we're going to go through each of those and look at them individually today. My guess is we're not going to have time to, well, particularly because we've had this interruption, but obviously there's going to be have to be a third and maybe a fourth lunch bites about the Cox Corridors here to get through all of it, because we've got another whole corridor after this one. Anyway, let's look at the scenes that were chosen as the 16 moments in what we call the Great Experiment. An Italian friend of mine has called the United States probably the greatest intellectual experiment in human history, and certainly I would say it's the most successful. And that's what we're trying to explain in this corridor. How did we build the society that we have, particularly our government, of course, which is at the center of this society, but all other aspects of the United States. And we begin, as American history often does, with the Mayflower Compact. Now, that's not politically correct anymore, but that's the way history has been written in the United States. And so one of the things I want you to think about as we're going through this is what other things, what other events should be added to the corridor if we were to extend it. What do we want to add? So think about that, and we can put those in the chat as we go along. We start with the Mayflower Compact because that is the first written form of government for the New World. And much of our society is based on the idea of consent of the governed, and that can be dated to the Mayflower Compact in 1620. So those are the people involved. Sorry, I didn't get myself all set up here. Then the Albany Congress in 1754, the British encouraged the Americans to get together. This is right after the in the conflict with the French, that it was encouraged that the colonies begin to speak with one voice. Now, historically, the British are probably sorry they did that, because of course that led to the colonies talking again against them. But this is the 1754 is the date we give for this first conference in which there was a formal discussion of these 13 colonies as being a single unit, having interests together enough to get together. And then the colonies got together on their own in the First Continental Congress, 1774. And of course, that led to the Second Continental Congress that had the Declaration of Independence in 1776. That led to the Constitutional Convention in 1787 after the victory in the Revolution, and the first Federal Congress based on the Constitution in 1789. So on the left here, you can see this is Benjamin Franklin's garden in Philadelphia. And that is Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Thomas Jefferson, and Robert Livingston. Then at the Constitutional Convention, I'm sorry, that's Alexander Hamilton, James Wilson, James Madison, and Benjamin Franklin. And then in the next inauguration is, First Federal Congress is James Madison standing, the Speaker Frederick Muhlenberg seated, Elbridge Gerry standing on the left, and Fisher Ames are the identifiable figures in the First Federal Congress. Now on the left, we have Washington's inauguration, also in 1789. And here we have Robert Livingston, the Chancellor of the state of New York, the chief judicial official. And he is the one who swore in George Washington there. Samuel Otis is standing between them there, and Elbridge Gerry. Frederick Muhlenberg is sorry, okay, we've got Samuel Otis, Robert Livingston, Samuel Otis, George Washington, and John Adams. Here are the identifiable figures there on the left. Now we have Washington writing his farewell address, which we know was written particularly by, first drafted at least, by Alexander Hamilton. And so that's Washington and Hamilton. And of course, this symbolizes the towering leadership of George Washington and the fact that he made the decision to leave office after 2 terms and set that standard, but also that his administration set the tone of the country, kind of carefully carrying out the majority, the consent of the governed, and not claiming personal power. And this is in many ways the thing that set this country off in a good and balanced way. And we have that George Washington to thank for that. Then we have the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. There is James Monroe, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who is actually the author of the Monroe Doctrine, but Monroe gets the credit for it. William Wirt, the Attorney General, the Secretary of War John Calhoun, Secretary of Navy Samuel Southard. That was the cabinet at the time of the Monroe Doctrine. Then Lincoln's second inauguration with Vice President Andrew Johnson behind him there, and Chief Justice Salmon Chase, who has administered the oath. And of course, there's the table that we still have in the Capitol that Lincoln used for that inaugural address. But now we jump more to other innovations of government, and the Smithsonian Institution, which was established by 1855, puts our government in the center of research and innovation in the society, and sets an intellectual standard. The Library of Congress, of course, quickly becomes an important institution, and this is the way the library appeared when it was in the Capitol itself. This was supposed to be the most beautiful room in America, designed by Thomas Walter, and was the way it was constructed after a fire, and it all too quickly filled with books, of course, and the books were stashed all over the Capitol building, and they had to build the Library of Congress building that we have today. But this was the room that stuck out on the west front. It had been added at the last minute in the 1820s to accommodate the library, but gives an indication of the extent to which this American society began to honor learning and the knowledge being passed down through this magnificent library. Then we have an iron foundry. On the left, to indicate the beginnings of heavy industry in this country, and then the steam dredger. On the left is the Nashua Iron Company, and on the right is the steam-powered amphibious boat, which represents not only the power of machinery, but the innovation that was going on in this country. The United States quickly became recognized after the Revolution as a source of innovation in invention. The patent office became very important, and we were recognized all over the world for the outpouring of ideas and innovations in machinery. And this was recognized all around the world and was connected with this open society that we had developed. It was felt that democracy and the consent of the governed led to this blossoming of the intellect and the application to the work of ordinary people. On the left here is Theodore Roosevelt, who stands sort of for vigorous government. And the other identifiable person in the painting is the man just below Roosevelt in the voter hat, is H.L. Mencken with his cigar there in his mouth. Then the last of these is women's suffrage. And this is the parade in 1917 which is connected with the final triumph of passing the women's right to vote. And the women in here are Anna Howard Shaw in the black robe, and probably the highest ranking woman in America at that point. Carrie Chapman Catt on the right is the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And this was the recognition of women's right to vote. So those are the 16 pairs or 8 pairs of murals that we have used to define American society. The way they're arranged, it comes out the women's right to vote is the climax of the great experiment. So now I want to open this up and get your questions and thoughts. So go ahead and put them in the chat. And while I'm at it, I'm going to run out and get a glass of water, and I'll be right back.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Steve, for this presentation. So once again, if you have questions for Steve, I'll pose them to him in a moment. If you put them into the Q&A section of the webinar system. Again, it looks like 2 speech bubbles, either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on what device you're using to join us today. So, Steve, why don't we start off with one along these lines? Do we have any sense of how Allyn Cox selected these specific scenes for the murals of the Great Experiment Corridor? How he, in particular, some of the different figures in the latter half of the corridor?
While I don't know any details, I do know that, first of all, of course, the U.S. Capitol Historical Society had a lot to say about it. Our president, Fred Schwingel, a congressman from Iowa, who was also a historian himself, was deeply involved in this. I have never discussed with anybody what the structure was within the society for this, but they tended to take things like that pretty seriously. But also the curator of the Capitol and the leadership of the committees.
Sure. Well, here, we're starting to get some questions. So why don't I go ahead and start posing some of them to you. Let's see here. Here's an interesting question, a little bit more about photography, but plays into how we talk about the Cox Corridors. One of our viewers asks how the curved artworks, because it's somewhat of a barrel ceiling, how those murals are captured in almost a flat rectangular form. You know, and that's, do you have any particular insights on how we're able to sort of, you know, without getting the weird distortions that we might otherwise get looking at them?
Well, actually, I don't know why this is, there we go. You can see on the left here, it is a little distorted, and
we need you to
the trimming looks a little odd in some places. I was going to find one where you can see Lincoln here is off.
We might need you to reshare to get.
Okay.
Because right now they just are looking at us, and we're a little bit distorted, I'm sure. But
okay.
But the question about the art is probably slightly more pressing.
Yeah. Let me try this. there we go. Okay, is that showing?
There we go. Yeah, it's shown.
Okay. Oh dear, started back at the beginning. Most of these pictures are actually ones that I myself took and then trimmed using PowerPoint. And so if you look at this picture on the right, up in the top left corner, you can see where my trim didn't come out very square. Look at the one on the left there, and you can see on the right edge of it, the room is a little skewed. So in fact, this is nothing magic. It's just a matter of what happens if you trim off the edges.
Sure.
So I did that all by hand.
Well, you did it so well that folks thought we had some trickery up our sleeves. So
thank you very much. I was thinking about that while I was doing it.
Kudos. So we have another interesting question from folks, because I know people are sending in, all manner of thoughts about other scenes that could be included, but one that I think gets to an interesting point is if additional scenes were to be added, who would make that decision to add those scenes, and sort of how would that process play out? So if you wouldn't mind, illuminating a little bit of the process side of how art gets added to the Capitol.
Well, the only comparison that we have, of course, is what's going on in Statuary Hall now. And those statues belong legally to the states, or at least are considered to belong to the state, probably not legally. So it's kind of a collaborative thing between the states and the Congress. We actually had Robert E. Lee's statue taken out without one to replace it, and that's the first time that's happened. Only 8 have been removed in the past anyway. There were 2 rather horrible looking sculptures on the front, what I think they call them the shoulders of the front steps.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. The plinths. No,
anyway, there were these 2 statues that were there, and so when they renovated the front of the building, they just kind of didn't bring the statues back. And they are in storage now, so those are the precedents that we have for this. I can't imagine they're actually going to take out any of these murals, but if we had a chance to add some, I think it's worth thinking about as to what it would be. And certainly the process would have to have the approval of the House Administration Committee and the Senate Rules Committee. And then the Joint Committee on the Library controls the artwork. And so that probably the Joint Committee on the Library would have the final say, but it would have to be approved at least by the leadership in the House and the Senate.
Sure.
But of course, the big problem would not be adding things, taking them out and substituting.
Right, because if I'm not mistaken, the Cox Corridors pretty well filled that side of the building, at least on that first floor. Is that correct?
Yes. The only thing left would be the walls. And for the reasons I already talked about, that's unlikely.
Sure.
But for instance, last month we talked about the architects, and there have been 2 more architects that have left since the portraits of the architects are put up, and that wouldn't be too difficult to find places for them. But certainly we're probably not going to have any movement to, first of all, to take out any of these scenes, although that would be interesting to see if we want to question some of these scenes. But the other would be what should be put in. But the big question we all have to ask ourselves, is the United States still a great experiment? And that's what this corridor is all about.
That is now quite a question to chew on, but if I can pose a couple perhaps slightly less weighty questions that have come through from our audience, a little bit about the technique and then the artistry of Allyn Cox. First, one that gets to one of the key distinctions. We know at the top while we were working through the technical difficulty, I talked about how Cox did a lot of the sort of finishing work on unfinished Bermuda projects, or some restoration work, or some addition to Bermuda projects. But one of our viewers posed the interesting question: how does the technique used by Allyn Cox differ from the technique used by Constantino Bermuda?
That is a very good question, and something I would have addressed later, but it's important to know. Bermuda worked in fresco. And in fact, Montgomery Meigs, who was in charge of construction and decorating the building, was adamant to use fresco because it's far more permanent than the other techniques that were available. But Allyn Cox did not. He actually glued a canvas onto the plaster and then painted on the canvas. And so in fact, there was a leak behind one of the scenes in the Hall of Capitals, the one with Clara Barton in the rotunda with the wounded soldiers. And there was a leak, and it began to bulge because the water was gathering behind it. So they had to quickly take it down, and they just used some kind of a solvent on the glue and took it right back off, and then glued it back on again. So that's Cox's technique is much easier to deal with than Bermuda's, because with a fresco, the paint is bonded to the plaster itself. And while there are things that one can do to remove it, it would not come off as a piece the way the canvas does. And so they were able to deal with that. So the Cox Corridor is paint on canvas, but the canvas is adhered to the plaster rather than being stretched across a frame like they usually are.
Sure. Well, that is a fascinating difference in how they approached a very similar project in paint, and decorating corridors.
Yes.
One other sort of technical artistry question, and then we'll shift back into some of the bigger pictures here. But one of our viewers points out that the color palette used in the Cox Corridors is really vivid and bright and lively, and wants to know if this was sort of is this an Allyn Cox signature kind of thing? Was he a very vibrant, bright colors artist, or if this was a departure from his normal work?
Well, that's a topic that I want to cover later in much more detail, but as I was spending time in the corridors several years ago, I asked myself, why in the world did Allyn Cox use these colors? And let me go back. You can see here, but you don't get a sense in these paintings. These paintings are much more muted colors than if you look at the photograph on the left, underneath that scene is kind of a cartouche done in green and orange, and it's very bright. And I asked myself, why in the world did he? And then it dawned on me that between the time that Allyn Cox painted this and today, the Bermuda corridors have been restored.
Oh.
And the fact is that when Allyn Cox saw the Bermuda corridors, they were green and orange and yellow. And so Allyn Cox was making a more vibrant version of what he saw in the Bermuda corridors. But in fact, now the color isn't very true on this photograph. But the Cox corridors are basically red, white, and the Bermuda corridors are basically red, white, and blue. But they had been touched up over the years by other artists. And so what Allyn Cox saw and was trying to match was a very different color palette than what we have now.
That makes a lot of sense. And
Yes.
gosh, that really, you can see how you could wind up with such a striking palette when he's trying to play into that overarching theme.
These are really good questions.
We've got such a great audience. We love our audience. One more Allyn Cox question before we get to some of the bigger picture stuff again, if you're up for it. Someone asks an interesting one: where is Allyn Cox buried? Do we know his final resting place?
We do, but I haven't looked it up.
Fair enough.
It's probably
he's
in
not
Wikipedia.
lost. He's just lost to us, if you will.
Yes, yeah. No, I do not know that one.
For sure. Well, here's an interesting query from an anonymous attendee. Does the visitor center have the room or theoretically the potential to add scenes in the style of the Cox Corridors?
That is a wonderful question, because yes, there are long hallways in the visitor center that would lend themselves to this in a very different way, because it's a very different space, and this would certainly not fit into the design concept of the visitor center, but certainly this kind of thing could be done, and so that's something we might think about in the future. This kind of heavy decoration is not fashionable in the art world now, and sure, in the architectural world. But that's I hadn't even thought about that. But that would be the place. Of course, they certainly expanded Statuary Hall with the statues that they put in the visitor center, and actually, they, now that I think about it, you know, they put extensive paintings in the cafeteria. There are actually photographs of some of the halls. The Bermuda corridors are up on the walls with wonderful decorations in the cafeteria.
That's right. Yeah.
You know, that would be another whole lunch bites to talk about those.
That would really put the lunch in lunch bites. So we could have some fun with that.
Yeah.
Let me pose you another sort of art content type question here. And again, kind of drawing parallels to the Bermuda corridors. Has there been a need to restore the Cox corridors since their completion? And if so, how has that project looked? If they've had to, I know you mentioned the leak behind Clara Barton, but have there been other issues that had to be touched up, restored in a similar way for the Cox corridors?
As far as I recall, no. That in fact the Cox paintings have held up very well. Let's see, it's been it was 70. Yeah, so it's been
nearly 50.
About 50 years.
And so that's USCHS quality right there.
73 actually wasn't.
Sure. So we're coming right up on the 50th anniversary of the Cox. Excellent. So yeah, and then let's close, because I know we try to keep folks on the noon to 1 time frame, and we might be able to just thread the needle here and pose this last question. Given the challenge of getting into the Capitol building as it is right now, what is a way that some of our viewers could actually explore the art of the Cox Corridors from home? What might be some avenues for them to learn a little bit more between our Lunch Bites episodes, of course?
There is some in Wikipedia, and there is a good section of the Architect of the Capitol's website, aoc.gov, and you can get to that just by putting Cox Corridors into Google. But I discovered that their collection is not complete, and so I had to go back and take some pictures of some of these, and their reproductions of the artwork are not that much better than my cell phone camera did, and so
so what we're hearing is there are other ways you can get some of the information. There are other ways you can do a little bit of exploration, but you really need to just come back and see Steve and the U.S. Capitol Historical Society if you want to get the full picture, the trimmed, adjusted, flat-looking picture, and really get the depth of knowledge and experience. Well, once again, folks, thank you so much for your patience during today's program. Thank you for your interest in and support of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, As Jane always says, we rely on the generosity and support of our members, friends, donors, supporters, and we appreciate all that you do to help us inspire and form patriotism through these public history programs. We hope you have a great rest of your week. Keep an eye out for those newsletter emails, and we will see you again real soon.